Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. Great to be here with all of you. A nice group of folks joining us today at 2 o'clock Eastern Time in the United States. I'm just north of New York, but wherever you're joining, you're probably much later in the evening in Europe or earlier on the West Coast. But yeah, so thanks everyone for being here. My name is Robert Rodriguez Jr. I'm a professional landscape photographer, printmaker, a teacher, workshop instructor, and I'm also honored to be a Canson Infinity ambassador since 2011. So that's quite a bit of time now. It just goes to show you how much I love Canson papers. Nothing has been able to lure me or tempt me away. Um, so on behalf of Canson Infinity, I'll be sharing this presentation today titled Exploring Matte Papers. So typically when I've talked about papers in the past, we kind of look at the whole range of papers, the matte papers, the non-matte papers, the Barytas, the platines, the glossy papers, etc. But today we're going to go deeper on the matte side, my favorite type of papers. So I'm going to give you a lot of information today, but some of it will be somewhat technical, but I hope that by the end, you'll see me repeating some terms and some ideas over and over again, and that'll help you to, understand these concepts a little bit better. And a lot of these are universal, so even if you're using other papers, you'll be able to apply them there. I can't promise that you'll get the same results with other papers because Canson papers do have a very unique qualities in terms of the coating and the way they're made, etc. And I'll talk all about that today. So what makes Canson's papers unique and special? Again, that's what I'm going to talk about. Try to give you some insight into why that is. Now, there are other approaches out there, of course, other people who teach printing or other books, etc. So this is only my personal approach, but it's based on a long, long time of making prints for myself and others. And it's one that prioritizes creativity, personal expression, and leveraging the amazing papers that Canson produces. So again, what's most important is that you can adapt these ideas for yourself and use them for your own creative goals. Whatever your photography is about, that's what you should be trying to apply them to. I'll be sharing my images and my work, but that's just because that's what I'm most familiar with. Again, I want this to be something you can adapt for yourself. Please share your questions in the chat. I will try to look as often as I can over there, but there is a lot going on. We also have Jane Dixon with us tonight, who is with Canson, and so she'll be helping me answer some questions as well. So with that said, let's get started. Now, before I talk about all the different papers, I just want to share my approach to selecting papers because I think this is kind of important, and it'll give you some idea about how I'm thinking about this. Now, the reason I think this particular approach is so powerful is because it allows you to make printing a creative process. You can really think about telling a story with your images. So this approach is what I call the image first approach. Basically, if you've heard me talk before or you've seen my webinars and talks in the past, instead of thinking about a paper that you can use for all of your images, I like to look at the image. I like to think about what I'm trying to say with the picture, what I'm trying to convey to the viewer, and then take advantage of the fact that different papers will allow me to express certain things stronger than other papers. Each paper has its own personality, its own quality, and that can potentially complement what you're trying to do with your image. So it's not about which paper is best for landscapes or black and white or anything like that. It's more about what are the paper's characteristics? What does it do really well? And will that actually help you to complement what you're trying to, or strengthen what you're trying to convey in the image? Now, each paper that Canson offers, as I said, has its own unique personality. And so even though they all do an excellent job of preserving the color and the detail in your images, each one provides a different interpretation, if you will. It will interpret the image in different ways. It will enhance or complement things in the image. Some of these qualities are very subtle and some are much more dramatic. And so I'm going to try to, again, fill you in on what these differences are in a way that, again, informs you and gives you more information, more knowledge. Now, we can divide paper into two broad categories. And these two categories are essentially the biggest aesthetic difference between the papers, and that's going to be Dmax. Dmax is a function or a measure of how much black a paper can hold. And so the more black a paper can hold, the more Dmax it has, the more contrast, the more aggressive the paper is going to look, the more aggressive it's going to make your image look. The lower the Dmax, then the less contrast the image will have. Now, this is extremely important because, generally speaking, contrast changes the way an image looks and feels on paper. And so if your photography has a particular certain kind of feel or look, you may want to take advantage of this fact that higher contrast has a particular feel and look, and lower contrast has a different look. And again, matte papers, as you can see, all matte papers have lower Dmax than non-matte papers. So if we're talking about any non-matte paper like a Platine or Baryta or Photo Satin or RC Gloss, all of those are going to have high Dmax. Matte papers are going to have a lower Dmax. And so today we're just going to be talking about just the matte papers, which all are going to have less Dmax, less overall contrast than higher Dmax papers. But that's not a negative. That's actually a plus. That's actually one of its strengths, because together with that lower Dmax, matte papers also have other very specific and unique properties, which is that, for example, they don't have a reflective surface, right? They have that beautiful non-reflective surface, that very matte look. You don't get a shine, so you get a very much softer look. As I said, lower Dmax. Lower Dmax, this is not a good or a bad thing. It's only a good or a bad thing for your images. It's not an inherently good or bad thing about the paper. The other thing that you get with matte papers that you don't get with non-matte papers is this incredible range of textures. And these textures can imbue your image with depth and dimension. It'll give your image a lot of almost like a 3D appearance, depending on what is in your image. It also gives your images a more fine art look and feel. You can think of it this like a painterly feel or subtle feel, less photographic. And I'm going to be using this term photographic, less photographic, more photographic often, because more photographic means it's going to look more like, like what we're used to seeing in terms of a picture on a glossy paper, very literal, very, sort of painterly. Whereas matte papers are going to be, again, softer, more expressive. They have more feel, painterly, less photographic, etc. Now, you can see here that I have a couple of Canson's papers up, and the Arche Aquarelle on the left-hand side is the most textured paper. The Arche 88, at least from this group, is going to be a very, very smooth surface. That already is going to give you some creative possibilities depending on what you have in your image and how you want to combine that with your image. And I'll talk more about that later and give you some tips to think about that. So again, this really requires you to think aesthetically about your image, about your images, and what it is that you think will work best. What is it that you think is strong about the image, and how do you want to use the paper to bring that across? Now, I want to talk a little bit about the technical aspect of making papers, because this is important. This way we'll understand the terminology that you see when you read the labels or you read the spec sheets or you go on Canson's website and you see different names. Every paper starts as a blend of cotton fibers and water and some other chemicals, and then they're formed into sheets. And then these sheets are basically rolled out and left, and dried out so that you get paper. Now, there's two different techniques or different methods of creating these sheets. One is a more modern technique using a modern machine called the Ford Rinier that produces papers that have a very consistent surface. They have a more modern look and feel, a more photographic type paper. Okay, there's an older method to creating paper called a cylinder mold. That's the type of machine that's used to create the paper. And a cylinder mold means that the paper gets a more sort of unique handmade feel. So the texture and the way the paper feels is more random. You have more subtle variations. And this will give you papers that have more of a fine art look and feel. Maybe you can think of it like less photographic, more painterly, maybe a more organic look and feel. But these are the two methods of making papers. So the cylinder mold made papers, which are the more fine art papers, those are the papers that you see labeled in terms of coming from the Arche mill. The Arche mill is an actual paper mill in France that just uses a cylinder mold machine. Papers like Arche 88, Arche BFK Reeves, Arche Aquarelle. And then there's another mill in the UK, which is called the Somerset mill, and they also use a cylinder mold machine. And these are some new papers that Canson has introduced recently called Somerset Satin, Somerset Velvet, Somerset Watercolor. And then the rest of Canson's papers are made at their own mill in Annonay, which uses the modern paper making method, the Ford Rainier machine. And those are papers like Baryta Photographique Matte, Rag Photographique, Edition Etching, Printmaking Rag, Vellon Museum Rag. So we talked before about papers that were more photographic, papers that were less photographic in terms of overall papers. Now, if we focus in on matte papers only, within the matte paper range, we can also apply these uh, these ideas. Matte papers that are more, let's say, modern looking, more photographic, a little more crispy, more crisp, more precise. And then we've got cylinder mold papers, which are more painterly, more tactile. They tend to feel a little more supple in your hand, more analog-like. Okay, these are just rough analogies. Now, I want to take you through each of the papers and show you the surface so that you can get a sense of what how the surface changes. Now, keep in mind that the best way to experience this is if you can actually hold the papers in your hand, because of course there's nothing like live in person, right? So I'm doing this over the internet. I've tried to take pictures as clearly and as precisely as I can, but these differences will be even slightly more pronounced if you were to see them in person. So let's start with I'm going to go from the smoothest, most photographic matte papers all the way to the most painterly papers. This is Baryta Photographique 2 Matte. It's got the highest Dmax of any matte paper, and you can just see the surface. It looks very flat, very smooth. You can see the back of my viewing station. In other words, below where the paper is, my viewing station has some little ripples and stuff that's on the metal. And you can see how smooth the paper is compared to that. So this is a very, very smooth paper. All right, so that's Baryta Matte. Now we move to Rag Photographique 2. Now this is a brand new paper that Canson just came out with. I'm not sure if it's available to the public yet, but it will be very soon. And Rag Photographique 2 is just an improvement over the original Rag Photographique, one of my favorite papers. Very smooth, but definitely more of a cottony fine art feel than the Baryta matte paper that I showed you previously. And this paper, the Rag Photographique 2, has a slightly better Dmax, a little bit better blacks, better tonal range and detail than the previous paper. So an improvement overall, but still very, very smooth. Now, this is edition etching. We're still talking about the modern made papers on the Ford Rainier machine. Edition etching, you can see, has a little more texture now, but the texture is very sort of consistent and pattern-like. You can see that it isn't very random or scattered. It's just very consistent across the paper. Still a wonderful paper. It's got great Dmax and just a little bit of texture to add some dimension to your image. Now, another thing that changes with the papers, in addition to the texture, is the warmth of the paper. So some papers are a little cooler and some are a little warmer. And I'm going to show you a chart at the end that shows you how the papers, how they arrange themselves on this chart from cool to warm and textured to non-textured. Now here's Arche 88. Now we're starting to look at the cylinder mold papers. These are a little more supple, a little softer, if you will. And I don't mean softer in terms of the printed image, but just the way they feel in your hand. They have more of a tactile feel. But again, you can see very smooth surface on the paper. So for a cylinder mold paper, the Arch-88 paper is probably your smoothest paper that you can get from the Canson line. Now here's BFK Reeves White, another cylinder mold made paper. But notice the texture on this paper. It's more random than the addition etching that I showed you 2 papers back. The addition etching, remember I mentioned, was it looked more uniform and patterned and consistent. This is more random, a little more, a little less pronounced in terms of its pattern. And so this has a beautiful texture on it. I love BFK Reeves when I need just a little bit of depth or dimension to an image that has texture in it already. And BFK Reeves comes in a white and a pure white version. The pure white version is just whiter, whereas the white version, it's just not as white, right? So it's going to be slightly warmer. These are relative things, of course. Now, I mentioned that Canson it just released or has recently released some new papers from a new mill. Not a new mill, the mill has been around for a long time, but new papers from this particular mill, the Somerset mill and the St. Cuthbert's mill, actually. But these are Somerset papers. This is the Somerset Enhanced Satin. Again, a cylinder mold paper, but you can see very smooth, not quite as smooth as the Arch-88. You can see that it has a little bit of tactile grain on the surface. You can use those words. But again, it's going to be smooth, the smoothest of the Somerset papers. Next one here is Somerset Enhanced Velvet. And you can see clearly here, it's much more textured than the previous paper, the satin. But again, the texture is sort of random. It's not uniform. Not quite the same as BFK Reeves. The BFK Reeves, the texture to me is a little bit tighter. This is a little bit looser, a little wider. But again, a wide texture, just beautiful to add, a beautiful paper that adds a lot of dimension on the surface of the print if your image, if it complements your image. And here is the most textured paper from the Somerset range. And in terms of, from my eye, this is Somerset Enhanced Watercolor. Again, a lot of another cylinder mold-made paper. Great for, deeper textures, gives a lot of depth. This paper and the one coming up, which is Aquarelle, these are particularly good for example, art reproductions. If you're a printer and you're reproducing art for others, this really emulates the feel of a watercolor paper or, a painting, things like that. So particularly useful for people who are reproducing artwork, but also photographers as well. I've used this paper if your image has a lot of texture in it, has something that is going to let the paper complement it. And then finally, the last paper in the range that I'm going to show today is the Arch Aquarelle. We're back to the Arch mill, but this is probably the most textured paper. Again, cylinder mold made, so it has a beautiful feel. And you can see the texture here is very varied, very random, larger and deeper than the Somerset watercolor. So it has the greatest texture, but surprisingly, and I'm always surprised when I see a print on Aquarelle, it preserves detail incredibly well. And that's because the coating that Canson puts on the paper, or the Arch mill they put on the paper, the coating really helps to keep the ink droplets from the printer nice and tight. It doesn't allow them to sort of seep into the paper. And the tighter you can keep those ink droplets, the sharper and more detail you'll preserve. And so the coating working together with the printer is key, is critical in terms of maintaining crisp detail. All right, so that's Arch Aquarelle. Now here's this chart, or I call it a matrix, that I talked about before. If you want to take a screenshot of this, it'd be a great time to do it. I'm going to explain what you're seeing on here. So along the bottom, okay, the x-axis from the left to the right, we have papers, matte papers that are more photographic or smoother. So they're going to have less texture on the left. And as we move to the right, we're going to have papers that are more textured. So you notice that the furthest paper on the right is the Somerset watercolor rag, and further up is the Aquarelle rag. Now, the y-axis, up and down, is essentially how warm or cool the papers are. So towards the top, the papers are going to be cooler and whiter, a whiter surface, a brighter surface. And down towards the bottom, they're going to be less white. I don't want to say they're brown or anything like that. They're nothing like brown. They're still white, but they just don't have the same coolness that the papers at the top do. So again, if you look at this of the papers, how I arranged them here, the papers in blue, those are the papers that are, let's call them more photographic or smoother surface. And that's papers like Baryta, Photographique 2 Matte, Arch 88, Rag Photographique, and Somerset Satin. Those papers have the least amount of texture. And then the Baryta Photo at the top is the coolest. That's going to have the coolest, whitest surface. And Somerset Satin is going to be the warmest. The papers in the middle are going to have some texture, moderate amount of texture. And those are the ones that I talked about before. Papers like BFK, Edition Etching, BFK Reeves. Notice the BFK Reeves white, which is down towards the bottom, and the BFK Reeves pure white. Same paper in terms of texture, but the pure white is much brighter, whiter than the regular BFK Reeves white. This might be something to think about if you want as much possible contrast from a matte paper. Then you may want to think about BFK Reeves pure white if you like the BFK Reeves surface, because it's going to give you a little bit more brightness, which is going to give you a slightly greater sense of contrast. And then the last papers, as I mentioned before, those are the most textured. Somerset watercolor is warmer. The Arch Aquarelle rag is going to be whiter and the most textured. All right, so I think this is a useful graphic to get a sense, a useful comparison to get a sense of all the papers and where they sit on these two qualities. Now, there are other qualities, of course, but from a visual standpoint, from something that you can sort of grasp right away, I thought that, again, texture, less texture to more texture, and warm to cool, how bright or less bright the paper is. I think these were useful metrics to think about, right? There are other qualities to the papers, such as the weight and things like that, but let's assume that the weight is the same for all the papers, heaviest weight papers for all of them. I think this is a nice way to get your head around, okay, which papers do I think would work best for me? If you don't like textures, then you're going to stay more towards the left side of this chart. If you like texture, but not a lot, you're going to stay somewhere in the middle. So me personally, I tend to be in the upper left quadrant. I like Arch 88, Baryta Matte, and I like BFK Reeves Pure White. I rarely go for a paper that's warmer because I want more contrast for landscapes and things like that. And I rarely go for a paper that has a lot of texture. That I will show you some that I have used texture on today, but usually I'm looking for something a little smoother, a little more nuanced. All right, so before we go to Lightroom, I'm going to jump over to my viewing station and I'm going to show you some more prints and show you some comparisons between the papers. Okay. So let me take this print down for a minute. We'll come back to this one in a minute. So let me show you an example of what I mean by texture. Here is the same image, and the one on the right is printed on Rag Photographique. The one on the left is printed on BFK Reeves. And for me, I would probably prefer to print this on BFK Reeves, which has the texture on the left here. Now, it's difficult to see the texture perhaps in the camera, but you can see it's got a slight texture on the surface. Now, why would I use a textured paper for this image? Well, in terms of the content of the image, all right, I've got textures all through the foreground, all through the middle ground, and even in the sky, right? It's not a clear blue sky with a beautiful gradation. It's got clouds, it's got atmosphere, it's got presence. And so I don't mind introducing a slight nuanced texture throughout the whole image. That just gives the image more depth, more dimension. It just gives it more of a 3D look and feel. It just gives it presence. And by the way, I will mention, even if you're framing behind glass, these effects don't go away. These the textures in the paper don't go away. They may be diminished a bit, but they're diminished for any print. The light still bounces off the papers differently depending on whether it's textured or not, and that's something that you still will be able to appreciate. Now, let me show you another example. Here's a very different kind of image. The one on the left is on a smooth paper, rag photographique. The one on the right is again on BFK Reeves. And I would most probably not use a textured paper for this image. Now, why is that? Well, unlike the previous image where I had texture kind of throughout the image, in this image, I've got areas that are very smooth, okay, very smooth in the water, very smooth in the sky. You see these beautiful gradations. And then I've got some textured areas on these boulders and rocks, and even back here on the part of the landscape. If I use a textured paper, I'm going to diminish those differences. I'm going to remove the differences that are already in the image and sort of negate the depth that I get in the image from these rocks being forward because they have more texture and the sky and the clouds way in the distance. So I definitely would want to use a smooth paper for this. A smooth paper means that I preserve the differences between the texture in the part of the image that has texture, but I'm also not adding texture in areas of the image that don't have texture. So that's an interesting way to think about texture, which is think about what's in your image. And if you want to preserve distinct areas of less and more texture in your picture, you probably don't want to use a textured paper because, again, you're going to diminish that. So here's an example where smooth paper preserves the inherent textures in the image. But on a matte paper, I definitely get this soft, beautiful look to the image that I lose somewhat if I print it on a gloss paper or a non-matte paper. The blacks get too dark. It feels more literal. I want this to be very dreamy-like because of the context and sort of the story that I'm trying to share. Now, let me show you an image on the highest Dmax matte paper, which is, oops, lost that. This is on Baryta Photographique 2 matte. And this is Canson's matte paper with the highest contrast, the highest Dmax, and yet it's still a matte paper. You can see here that there's no reflection at all, but very, very, very smooth. You get rich blacks. Nice when you have an image that has light in it, that you want to project the energy of the light. So for me, this image works really well on this paper. Very, very smooth. So there isn't any texture added to it, meaning that I can really preserve, again, the separation between the sky in the background and the textures in the foreground. But the richness of the blacks, the way that I can project the light here, that is produced by the blacks. Yet this paper allows me to print it on a matte finish without having to go to something that's shinier. I just prefer a softer look and feel to this image. Again, this is my own preference. This is what I'm trying to do with my images. Just ideas for you to think about. Here's another example of printing onto Baryta Photographique 2 matte. Similar idea as the last image. Beautiful rich blacks here on a matte paper. I mean, almost Dmax on this paper is almost as high as you would get on a Baryta or a Platine, and yet wonderful soft surface, no shininess. Again, very, very smooth image, smooth surface. And because this paper is the whitest of all of the matte papers, right? It's the paper is the coolest. You get a lot of contrast. Again, for me, great in terms of capturing and projecting the energy that I want to convey in this image, sunlight, clouds, etc. Now I want to move to we'll move to the next textured paper, not the Baryta matte, but this is Rag Photographique 2. Still very, very smooth, but not as bright, not as clinical feeling, if you will, as the Baryta matte that I showed you before. This is a little more, has a more fine art feel to it, but very, very smooth. This is the Brighter Photographic 2, very smooth, great Dmax. They've improved that from the previous generation. And for an image like this, where I want to preserve just the softness of these skyscrapers extending into the fog and into the clouds, this paper really captures that well. Whereas a non-matte paper would, I think, project too much of the contrast and the shadows and the blacks. I don't really want that. I want something that feels much more, less literal, much more ephemeral, if you will. Okay, kind of like you're rising up and going into, into space. And so rag photography 2 is great for this, but again, smooth, no texture because I don't want to introduce any texture here. I want this to remain as smooth as possible so that it creates that aura, that feeling. Now this is Arch 88. So if the previous one, rag photography 2, is smooth, uh, modern made paper, this is slightly, I don't want to even call it textured. It's got a slight sort of grain on the surface. This is a mold-made paper, so it feels a little more supple. You can see it has more of just a beautiful feel to it. And yet, with an image like this, it maintains and holds those blacks really well. I love the shadows that I have here. The shadows aren't, uh, it doesn't feel like I'm trying to show you the shadows, but it holds the depth of the image so that I create this sense of layering in the picture. And I like a matte paper for this image because once again, it just conveys the feel that I'm trying to project in the image. And no texture here. Again, I got smooth surfaces, the sky very smooth, the water. I don't want any texture in there that would, I think, take away from the differences that I already have in the image. Here's another example, and I'm showing you, perhaps intentionally or not, I don't know, lots of black and white images because I just love the way black and white images print on Arch 88. They just gain this very filmic, analog-y feel that I don't get when I print onto a non-gloss paper, at least for this, non-matte paper, sorry, at least for these kinds of types of images. Again, Arch 88, same as before, very smooth surface. These are all, by the way, 300 or 310 GSM weight papers. I always use the heaviest paper because it just feels better and it feels more substantial in my hand. It gives a more tactile feel. And again, here you can see how I maintain the layering here, but I don't need to expose all of the detail in these layers here. It's just a question of moving the eye up through this very abstract shapes. So I'm not trying to capture tremendous detail in the shadows. I'm trying to capture a feel for the entire image. And here's one more on, this is on Rag Photographique, the first version. But again, on Rag Photographique, very, very smooth surface. This paper you can see doesn't feel quite as supple as the Arch does. Okay, this is the machine-made paper, not quite as velvety, if you will. But for this image, no texture because I want to maintain this very smooth up here and just enough shadows to give me a feel for the image. It's this early morning, very quiet, very serene. I don't need something aggressive. I don't want something to be loud, if you will. I want something very soft and nuanced, more painterly. Okay, I'm going to move to some medium textured papers now. And the first one here, let me just grab one. Okay, here we go. So this is printed on BFK Reeves, and this is BFK Reeves Pure White. That means that the paper is a little whiter than the normal BFK Reeves. You can see it's brighter. I wanted something as bright as possible to again maintain the energy of the light in the image. But why BFK Reeves? Well, BFK Reeves has this wonderful random texture. It's a cylinder mold made paper, and you can already see, right? The texture in the paper just adds a sense of depth and dimension to these rich textures in the image, going up through the mountains, even into the sky. And the textures complement, they sort of blend together with the textures in the picture. So for me, this is a kind of a no-brainer that I would use a paper that had some texture in it and yet maintain the richness, the color, the detail that BFK does. So there's no lack of detail or anything in this image. Here's another example of BFK Reeves, and I'm going to show you same image, okay, but the one on the left is BFK Reeves pure white, and on the one on the right is BFK Reeves white. So the one on the right is the paper is just not as bright. The one on the left is brighter. You can see the difference in the tone of the paper, very slight, but hopefully you can notice that. And I probably will go with the pure white because the pure white just gives me a little more presence, if you will, a little more contrast, a little more pop to the highlights. But again, at the same time, uh, I get this wonderful contrast that blends into the image. Yes, I am throwing some contrast into the sky here. Typically, I probably would not want to do that. Sometimes I'll experiment and see how it feels, what it looks like. And I don't mind here throwing some throwing some texture, adding some texture to the sky. It just adds more depth to the picture. And the depth really isn't coming from the sky. It's coming from all these layers here up to the clouds. All right, but the main thing I wanted to show you here is the difference between the pure white and the regular white, or just white. One more here. This is on Somerset Velvet. I have it written on the back. Sorry, goes like this. And Somerset Velvet, as I mentioned before, is one of Canson's newer papers. Somerset Velvet has even more of a pronounced texture than BFK does. You can see it here. Hopefully, you can see some of that there. And you can see here, I have an image that's very abstract, very textured. So there's no real sense of thinking about areas that have less or more texture in the picture. The whole picture is about texture and color. And so for me, because it's about texture and color, a matte paper just brings that out so much more. It feels more painterly, more abstract, more organic. Okay. And again, the textures in the paper complement the image really well. So maybe I would go with BFK for this, or maybe I would go with Somerset Velvet. Somerset Velvet is a slightly stronger texture. I think it works perfectly for this image, but it's a paper that I would use less often for most of my images. So that's what you have to think about is what is your photography about? What are your images about in general? And then pick papers that, will work for most, if not all, situations. Okay, and I'm going to move now on to heavily textured papers. And this first one is Arch Aquarelle. And as I mentioned before, Arch Aquarelle is the paper that has the most aggressive texture, the uh, least subtle texture of all of Canson's papers. Hopefully you can see texture here. Even when I rub my finger on it, it feels like a fine sandpaper, okay? But it's got a wonderful texture, very bright. So that's the other thing about Aquarelle is that it's a very bright paper, similar to the BFK Reeves Pure White. And yet for an image like this, once again, here's an example of an image where texture is one of the key core ideas in the image that I want to convey, texture and color. And the Aquarelle just really makes it much more dimensional than a non-matte paper would. So you really get a feel, a sense of the depth of the image itself. So for me, Aquarelle works perfectly with this image. And here's an example of where I would use it without hesitation. One more image. This is, I believe, also Arch Aquarelle. And so I think you're probably thinking already, guessing what I'm going to say, but same thing. Here's a very sort of graphic image about color and certainly about texture. And for me, I was thinking about Aquarelle right from the moment that I thought about printing this image. There's the surface again. You can see that random texture on the surface. It works beautifully for this kind of image. And yet, hopefully you can see that there's no loss of detail, that the image doesn't feel soft or anything like that, and yet it has this very organic, dimensional quality to it. It's hard to put into words. Hopefully you can get a sense of that over the camera, over Zoom. But if you saw it in person, you could really hold it up to the light and see how much of a dimension the paper gives to the image. And as I mentioned before, that isn't lost when you put it behind glass. You can still appreciate that for sure. Okay, so let's move back over to main computer here. So I'm going to share now Lightroom, and I'm just going to show you some quick tips on printing an image, particularly when you're printing on matte paper. I use Lightroom for my printing. I love the workflow of going from my raw file into the print module, into the develop module, soft proofing, and then taking it into the print module. So let's assume that I want to print this image. Once I've done my adjustments and my edits, like I have here, then I would typically press S to go into the soft proof mode. And then I'm going to press Y, and that shows me the original image on the left and the soft proof version on the right. And you want to select the profile that you're going to print with so that it'll show you how the image, more or less, it'll simulate what the image is going to look like on the paper that you're going to use. So for this image, let's say I'm going to print this onto, BFK Reeves. And so I'm going to select BFK Reeves here, pure white. And when I select BFK Reeves, you'll see that there's a subtle change on the right-hand side. That's just Lightroom giving you a sense of what it's going to look like. For the most part, you just want to compare the image left and right, make sure that there's nothing obvious that looks off, and you want to also check to see if one of the rendering intents is better than the other. So over here, you can see I can switch between perceptual and relative. And if I go to perceptual or relative, the relative looks a little darker, so I'm going to stick to perceptual. So that's the rendering intent that I will use when I go into the print module. Now I'm going to go into the print module, and I've already laid this out on the paper that I'm going to use. Just a few quick things. I'm going to be using a Canon printer here. It's similar for Epson, but one thing that I love about Canon printers is that when I go into the printer options to select the media type, okay, Canon, not Epson, Canon will allow you to add custom media types. And Canson provides you with special files, AM1 files, and those files are media types that you can load into the Canon driver. What that means is that right in the Canon driver, I can select one of Canson's papers directly. So you've got your normal papers that all Canon printers come with, but here in custom, you can see that I've loaded in Canson papers using the file supplied by Canson, and I can select now the exact paper that I want to use. So instead of guessing and trying to say, okay, which paper is it and what does Canson recommend, I can just say here, okay, I'm going to use Rag Photography 2 or BFK, whatever it is. All right. And so I said that I was going to use BFK. So that's it right there. And then print quality highest, no color correction. Make sure that your color correction is off. You want Lightroom to control the color. I hit OK. I hit save. And then here in the print module, I just want to make sure that I'm using the correct media type. And in this case, I want to use the BFK. All right, and so that's how I would set up my printer. I'm not going to get too much into other things like resolution and so forth. I've covered that in other webinars, and I don't want to get bogged down in that now. But I'm going to send this to the printer at 300 ppi because that's the native resolution of my Canon. And I'm going to click on print. Of course, I've already printed this image, so let's take a look and see what that looks like. Yeah, that print is. Okay, here it is. So again, this is on printed on BFK Reeves, and this is just the normal white, not the pure white. But I was very happy with the way this print came out. Again, why did I use BFK Reeves? Because it has a really nice texture on the surface, and this texture complements the image well. Notice that I have texture throughout the image. I've got texture in the foreground and the trees. Everything in the image has a certain amount of texture to it. That adds depth to the image. You can see all the textures here, as well as in the grasses. And so using BFK allows me to project and promote that texture, to complement that texture to give the image more depth. And matte paper, again, I don't really want to emphasize the blacks in the foreground. I don't want to emphasize the tree trunks. I want to emphasize the overall feel of the entire image. A high contrast paper, which is excellent for many images, but for this image, I think would make the trees feel too heavy, too dark. And I don't really want that. I want it to be more about the light streaming in from the back, about just the feeling of the grasses moving into the distance. I want something more organic, less photographic, more painterly, more subtle, all those words that I've used before. And that's where I think a matte paper, and particularly in this case, the BFK Reeves, works pretty well. Okay, so I think that wraps it up for what I wanted to cover today. And I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has any questions. Let me open up my does anyone have any questions that they want to ask? Any questions at all? Yeah, I just want to show also about is that a magnetic viewing board? Yes, it's a viewing station made by a company called GTI. It is metal, and so I can use those little magnets to hold the paper onto the back. And there's also a little mechanism in the top where I can insert a paper and it'll stay on there as well. And the paper chart, yes, I will make it available to Canson so that they can distribute it whichever way they like. I can go back to that in case you want to take a quick screenshot of that. That's there. I'm assuming that that's what you're talking about. So, Alan says, I print from the Canon print and layout app installed in Lightroom Classic. Have you tried that app? Yes, I've tried that app. I still prefer printing in Lightroom. I think that I like staying in one app versus going to a separate app. I like the workflow. I like that everything feels connected. That's just my preference, but whatever works for you, whatever you're most comfortable with, that's always what I advise you use. It could be another program, it could be Photoshop, whatever. The point is that you're being able to do and achieve what you want to achieve. And for me, I personally like the unified sort of workflow. Any other questions before we sign off? Yeah, I definitely suggest that you give the matte papers a try. Canson does provide a discovery packs for different papers. I think there's an Arch Discovery Pack and a Somerset Discovery Pack. So you get, I believe, 2 sheets, a couple of sheets of each of the papers. That's a great way to experiment. One of the things I will mention also is I've been asked about, for example, using cheaper paper to make proofs, some very inexpensive paper. I think that overall my approach is using inexpensive paper to kind of make proofs is fine when you are learning everything about printing. So when you're experimenting with editing your images, with how changes in the editing of the image affects the print, when you're learning printing in general, when you're learning color management, all those things, definitely I would not be using expensive paper when you're learning. So there's a great place to use inexpensive papers. However, once you get comfortable, once you feel like you are getting consistent results, proofing on an inexpensive paper is not going to tell you or give you a sense of what it's going to look like on a finished paper, like a more expensive and more fine art paper like Canson. There's going to be differences in the textures, the coating, etc. So the only way to really get an actual proof is to print on the paper that's going to be your final destination. So you can use a smaller paper, of course, if you're going to make a bigger print. But I can think the inexpensive papers are good for learning. But once you learn and you're getting consistent results, you want a proof on the actual paper, because there will be differences if you use a cheaper paper going to a better paper. You may discover that it's sharper, or you get more contrast, more density, more separation in the shadows, and then you'll say, "Oh, wait a second, I thought that this was the right paper, and now I'm noticing that I can actually use this paper instead." So things like that. How do you get the Canson profiles into the Canon paper dropdown? So they're not profiles; those are the uh, uh, media types. And the way you do that is by using the Canon media configuration tool. And so I'm actually creating a video that will be on my YouTube channel soon about how to do this. It's pretty straightforward, but Canon provides you with a piece of software called the Canon media configuration tool. You download that from Mac and Windows, and then you download the AM1 file from Canson for your paper and media type. So in fact, I will show you here very quickly what that looks like on the Canson website. So for example, here I am on the Canson website, and I've selected my printer, the Pro 1100, and you'll see here that, for example, Arch 88, I can download the profile by clicking here and clicking on download. But in addition to the profile, the media type, instead of it telling me what media type I should use in the Canon driver, or for example, if you were using an Epson printer, instead of it telling you what media type you should use in the Epson printer, it says here AM1 file included, AM1X file included. AM1X file, sorry about that. So when you download that, you'll get 2 files. The ICC profile that goes installed in your operating system on your computer. And there's some instructions on here at the bottom, how to install the ICC profile. And then there's the AM1X file. That's the file that you would install with the Canon media configuration tool. It involves importing the file into your printer, and that's how you get it to appear in your Canon driver, which is, I think, very cool and very speeds up the workflow, because now you don't have to guess, well, not guess, but you don't have to make this conversion from, the Canon media type to Canson's recommended media type, etc. You can select the actual paper right in the driver. Karen asks, how do these papers evolve with time? Is there a difference between BFK Reeves and BFK Reeves Pure White? Well, if you mean over time in terms of once you make a print, Canson's papers are some of the best in terms of longevity, because they don't use any OBAs, optical brighteners, that potentially can change the way the print ages over time. So archivalness is one of the top benefits, priorities, features of Canson papers. If you mean how do the papers change coming from Canson, that's another one of the major benefits of using a manufacturer that owns their own paper mills. They're not outsourcing it from another company, which means the other company can decide, the other mill that they don't own, let's say, doesn't can decide to change the manufacturing. because Canson owns their own mills, they control the manufacturing process. They can make sure that the papers remain consistent over time. So if you print on BFK Reeves, you know, now, and you want to print on BFK Reeves 3 years from now, 5 years from now, you can be sure it'll be the same paper if it's got the same name. It's not going to be changed without you noticing, which happens often with other manufacturers. I won't mention any names. Um, Keith asks, I have been using Photography 2 in the UK, but there's no RAG designation. Is it the same paper? Um, I believe that it would be the same paper. Hopefully Jane can answer that. But if it says RAG, well, yeah, RAG, right? So in the US, it's called RAG. Keith is saying in the UK, it doesn't have the RAG designation. But if it's Photographique 2 and it's a matte paper, I'm almost 100% certain it's the same paper. There may be some difference in the way they're marketed worldwide, but Photographique as a matte paper is going to be the same paper. Russ says, given you use a calibrated monitor, do you normally get a good print the first, second, third time around? Great question, Russ. I often hesitate to answer this question because I don't want to. I think there's this idea that printing is this black magic mystique kind of thing. But yes, once your system, once my system, once your system is calibrated properly and you're using the software properly, I'm rarely changing papers or changing my prints because the colors are off. It's always about, that paper is interesting. How does this paper work? Maybe I like this paper better, but I don't have to print an image 3 times to get a print that I like from a color accuracy standpoint. Again, calibration is critical and understanding color management is critical. I talked about that, or actually the last Canson webinar was all about color management. But this isn't a a dark art or anything like that. Of course, there's a craft to it, and you have to understand how to use the software. But for sure, the print that I just made that I showed you a minute ago, I printed that before the webinar started. That's the first one, and it matches my screen pretty closely. It's never going to be 100% because I'm comparing a textured paper in the real world to a digital display, but close enough for me to feel that, yes, I'm willing to sign my name on the bottom and, frame it and sell it or give it away. Yeah, printed. Thanks, Karen. Printed pic. Yes. In terms of archivalness, most of Canson's papers are rated for 150 to 200 years if you protect them properly. Greater than 200 years plus if you keep them away from UV, ozone, things like that. So if you have them in a box or somewhere where they're stored properly, archivalness is one of the most important core features and values of Canson's papers. That's why they're museum grade, etc. And by the way, this could be important to you if you want to, give your prints to your kids or pass them down through the generations. It's not just about having them in a museum, but you know that your kids and grandkids may be able to look at your prints and they'll look the same as when you made them because you used good quality paper. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that was helpful. I hope you learned something about matte papers. You can always reach out to me personally, directly, or reach out to Canson, and we're always happy to help. As I said, I use Canson papers because I love them. I think they are the best on the market, and my images are how I make my income, so I want them to look as good as possible. If you want to find out more about me and my work, check out creativepathworkshops.com. I have a membership academy there where we regularly talk about printing. We have a normal print labs. We talk about editing, developing, and establishing your creative voice, basically how to become a better visual storyteller. So you can check that out there. And I guess that'll be it for today. Thanks again, everyone. See you next time.